Boarding a packed Ohio Airlines flight, Marcus, a black man, claims his first-class seat, only to be shamed by a prejudiced flight attendant. She has no idea he owns the airline, and her actions will ignite a fight for justice. The Ohio Airlines terminal in Chicago was a whirlwind of activity, a symphony of hurried footsteps, rolling suitcases, and crackling announcements that filled the air with a restless energy. Travelers darted through the polished halls, some clutching coffee cups, others dragging oversized luggage, their faces a mix of excitement and exhaustion. Amid this bustling crowd, Marcus Jackson stood quietly near a row of check-in counters, his first-class boarding pass held loosely in his hand. At 35, Marcus carried himself with a quiet confidence that didn't demand attention but couldn't be ignored. His casual hoodie and jeans stood out against the sea of tailored suits and designer dresses around him, a deliberate choice that reflected his unassuming nature. He'd just wrapped up a grueling but triumphant business trip in Chicago, a milestone for Ohio Airlines, the company he'd built from nothing over the past decade. Today's flight to Cleveland wasn't just a trip home, it was a rare moment for Marcus to pause and reflect on his journey. A success he rarely flaunted, despite its magnitude. Marcus adjusted the strap of his carry-on bag, his eyes scanning the terminal as he made his way toward the first-class lounge. The lounge was a sanctuary of privilege, its plush leather chairs arranged in neat clusters, the soft glow of ambient lighting casting a warm hue over the space. A faint jazz melody played in the background, mingling with the low hum of conversation as passengers sipped complimentary lattes, tapped away on laptops, or flipped through newspapers. Marcus settled into an armchair near a floor-to-ceiling window, the view of the tarmac stretching out before him. Planes taxied in the distance, their engines a steady hum, while ground crew members in neon vests moved with practiced efficiency. He placed his boarding pass on the table beside a steaming cup of coffee, the rich aroma grounding him as he took a moment to breathe. His phone buzzed softly, a message from his assistant Lisa lighting up the screen. "Boarding soon, let me know when you're settled." Marcus smiled faintly, his fingers moving quickly to type a reply. "Almost there." "All good." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the boarding pass. Few people in the lounge, or on the flight for that matter, knew that Marcus was the owner of Ohio Airlines. He preferred to keep a low profile, a habit rooted in his father's teachings of humility. Growing up in a small Ohio town, Marcus had watched his father, a factory worker, treat everyone with the same respect, whether they were a neighbor or a stranger. That lesson had stayed with Marcus, guiding him even as he rose to the top of the aviation industry. He didn't need to flaunt his success. He let his actions speak for him. But not everyone saw Marcus the way he saw himself. As he sat there, a group of passengers at a nearby table glanced in his direction, their whispers barely audible over the lounge's soft music. "Does he even belong here?" one of them muttered, a middle-aged man in a pinstripe suit, his tone laced with skepticism. His companion, a woman in a sleek blazer, nodded slightly, her eyes flicking toward Marcus's hoodie. "Probably got a free upgrade or something," she replied, her voice low but cutting. Marcus heard the words, but he didn't react, his expression unchanged. He'd heard comments like that before, too many times to count. They stung, but he'd learned to let them roll off his back, focusing instead on the work that had brought him here. Still, the whispers planted a seed of unease, a quiet reminder of the biases he'd faced his whole life. Biases that no amount of success seemed to erase. The boarding announcement crackled through the terminal, pulling Marcus from his thoughts. "Ohio Airlines Flight 247 to Cleveland is now boarding first-class passengers at Gate 12, the voice declared. Marcus stood, adjusting his carry-on bag over his shoulder, and joined the first-class line, his boarding pass ready. The line moved quickly, passengers shuffling forward with their tickets in hand, their faces a mix of anticipation and impatience. At the gate, lead flight attendant Emily Harper stood poised, her blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, her navy uniform crisp and polished. She scanned each boarding pass with a practiced smile, her movements efficient but mechanical. "Welcome aboard," she said warmly to an older white man in a tailored suit, her tone bright. To a woman clutching a designer purse, she chirped, "Enjoy your flight." But as Marcus stepped forward, her demeanor shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Emily took Marcus's pass, her eyes narrowing briefly as she scanned it. The ticket clearly read first class, the seat number 3A, printed in bold letters. Yet Emily's smile tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. She looked Marcus up and down, her gaze lingering on his hoodie, her expression shifting from professional warmth to something colder, more judgmental. "Economy is down the aisle," she said, pointing toward the back of the plane without meeting his eyes. Marcus blinked, the words catching him off guard. He glanced at his pass, then back at Emily, his brow furrowing slightly. "This pass says first class," he replied, holding it up for her to see, his voice steady but tinged with confusion. Emily didn't waver, her tone remaining polite on the surface but carrying a sharp edge of dismissal. "There must be a mistake. Please head to economy," she insisted, her eyes flicking toward the growing line of passengers behind him, as if urging him to move along. Marcus's grip tightened on his carry-on, the sting of her words hitting him like a slap. It wasn't just the rejection. It was the assumption behind it, the unspoken judgment that he didn't belong, that he couldn't possibly be a first-class passenger. The whispers from the lounge echoed in his mind, amplifying the sting. He'd faced this kind of injustice before, countless times, but it never got easier. Each encounter was a reminder of the barriers he'd had to break through, the stereotypes he'd had to defy to build Ohio Airlines into what it was today. He took a deep breath, his jaw tightening as he fought to keep his composure. Marcus knew he could reveal his identity right then and there, but that wasn't his way. He'd built his empire on principles of dignity and respect. He wouldn't let Emily's prejudice strip him of that. Still, the humiliation burned, a quiet fire that fueled his resolve to stand his ground. Marcus stepped onto the plane, his posture steady despite Emily's harsh dismissal at the gate. As he walked down the aisle to his assigned seat, 3A, he noticed an older woman struggling with her carry-on, her hands trembling as she tried to lift it into the overhead bin. Without hesitation, Marcus set his own bag down and approached her. "Let me help you with that," he said softly, his voice warm. The woman looked up, her eyes crinkling with gratitude. "Oh, thank you, young man," she replied, her voice shaky but sincere. Marcus lifted the bag with ease, securing it in the bin before offering her a small smile. "No trouble at all," he said, his kindness a quiet act of defiance against the judgment he'd already faced. The woman patted his arm gently, her touch a small comfort in the storm brewing around him, before he settled into his seat, adjusting the window shade to let in a sliver of light. But the moment of peace shattered as Emily's heels clicked sharply against the floor, her presence looming over the row like a storm cloud. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her tone firm but dripping with condescension, each word carefully chosen to assert her authority. "First class is for paying passengers, and frankly, you don't look like you belong here." The words were a dagger, sharp and deliberate, her prejudice laid bare for the entire cabin to hear. Marcus looked up, meeting her gaze, his voice steady despite the weight of her accusation. "I am a first-class passenger. Here's my ticket," he said, extending the pass toward her, his movements deliberate. He expected the matter to be resolved quickly, a simple misunderstanding cleared up with a glance at the ticket. But Emily didn't take the pass. Instead, she crossed her arms, her expression hardening into one of skepticism, her blue eyes narrowing as she looked him up and down. "I don't think so," she said dismissively, her voice low but cutting. "Step aside while I handle this." Her words struck Marcus like a punch to the gut, a painful reminder of the biases he'd fought his entire life. The rejection wasn't just about a seat. It was about his very right to exist in this space, to claim the success he'd worked so hard for. The older woman he'd helped turned her head, her expression shifting to one of quiet disapproval, but she said nothing, her silence a stark contrast to the warmth she'd shown moments ago. Around him, other passengers began to murmur, their whispers filling the cabin like a rising tide. A businessman in a gray suit a few rows back leaned toward his companion, muttering, "He's probably in the wrong section." A woman in a silk scarf cast a pitying glance, her lips pursed in silent judgment. Others stared openly, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disdain. as if Marcus's presence in first class was an anomaly they couldn't quite process. The weight of their gazes pressed down on him, each look a dagger, each whisper a judgment, amplifying the humiliation Emily had inflicted. Emily didn't stop there. She took a step closer, her voice growing sharper, her polite facade slipping further with every word. "Let me see your ticket again," she demanded, her tone now openly hostile. "Are you sure you didn't take someone else's pass? People like you don't usually fly first class." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and deliberate, her words a blatant display of prejudice that made the air in the cabin feel thicker, more oppressive. Marcus held out the ticket once more, his hands steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. "It's mine," he said firmly, his voice unwavering, a quiet strength in his words. "I belong here." Emily let out a scoff, the sound sharp and dismissive, her eyes flicking around the cabin as if seeking validation from the other passengers. "I'll need to verify this," she said curtly, turning on her heel and walking away, her heels clicking with a rhythm that matched the pounding of Marcus's heart. Marcus sat motionless, the knot of embarrassment tightening in his chest, a suffocating pressure that made it hard to breathe. The whispers around him grew louder, the passengers' murmurs a constant reminder of the scene unfolding. He could feel their eyes on him, each glance a dagger, each whisper a judgment. He wanted to stand up, to shout that he wasn't just a passenger, that he owned this airline, that he'd built it with his own hands, but he didn't. Marcus had learned long ago that dignity wasn't about proving yourself to others. It was about holding your head high, even when the world tried to push you down. The memory of his father's words echoed in his mind. "Always carry yourself with dignity, even when others don't." Still, the humiliation burned, a fire that threatened to consume him if he let it. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. The small act of kindness he'd shown the older woman, a quiet anchor in the storm, a reminder of the values he held dear. From the galley at the front of the cabin, a young flight attendant named Grace watched the scene unfold, her expression clouded with unease. Grace, a soft-spoken woman with warm brown eyes and a gentle demeanor, had joined Ohio Airlines only a few months ago, eager to start her career in the skies. She had always admired the professionalism of her colleagues, but Emily's harshness had been a rude awakening. Grace had seen Emily snap at passengers before, those who asked too many questions or who didn't fit her idea of a first-class traveler. But this was different. This was blatant, unapologetic prejudice, and it made Grace's stomach churn. Her hands fidgeted with the edge of her apron as she stood there, torn between her role and her sense of right and wrong. She thought of her own brother, a young black man who'd faced similar discrimination, and the memory fueled her unease, making Emily's words feel personal, cutting deeper than they should have. Grace glanced at her colleague, a junior flight attendant named Tom, who was busy preparing a tray of drinks. "This isn't right," she whispered to him, her voice barely audible over the hum of the cabin. Tom nodded slightly, his expression uneasy, but he didn't respond, his focus on the task at hand. Grace's unease grew as Emily returned, her voice louder now, her polite mask slipping completely. "Sir, I need you to move to economy," Emily declared, her tone sharp enough to make nearby passengers glance up from their screens. "This seat is assigned to someone else." Marcus held up his pass again, his voice steady but firm, a quiet strength in his words. "This is my seat. How can it be assigned to someone else?" he asked, his eyes locking onto Emily's, refusing to back down. Emily's eyes flashed with irritation, her patience wearing thin. "If you don't comply, I'll call security," she said, her voice cold and unyielding, the threat hanging in the air like a storm about to break. The tension in the cabin surged, a palpable energy that seemed to ripple through the rows of seats. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, some whispering to their neighbors, others staring openly at the unfolding drama. Grace took a tentative step closer, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to speak up, to say something, anything, to stop this injustice. But fear held her back. She was new, still on probation, and crossing Emily, the lead flight attendant, could cost her the job she'd worked so hard for. Yet, as she watched Marcus sit there, his composure unshaken despite the humiliation, A spark of courage ignited within her. Grace's quiet whisper to Tom, "This isn't right," was a small act of defiance, a glimmer of hope in the storm, a sign that Marcus wasn't entirely alone in this fight. The standoff escalated as Emily's voice cut through the cabin like a blade, her words sharp and unyielding, slicing through the tense air with a chilling finality. "I've warned you," she snapped, her earlier pretense of politeness completely gone, replaced by a cold determination that made the air feel heavier, more oppressive. Her hands trembled slightly with a mix of anger and self-righteousness as she reached for the intercom, her fingers fumbling for a moment before she pressed the button. "We have a situation in first class," she announced, her tone ringing with an authority that seemed to echo off the walls of the cabin, amplifying the tension until it felt almost suffocating. Whispers spread like wildfire among the passengers, their murmurs a chaotic buzz that filled the space with an electric energy. A businessman in a crisp suit, his tie perfectly knotted, muttered to his seatmate, "Looks like he's causing trouble," his voice dripping with judgment, his eyes narrowing as he adjusted his cufflinks. A woman in a tailored blazer nodded in agreement, her lips curling into a smirk. "Good for her. First class isn't for just anyone," she whispered back, her tone laced with prejudice, her words a stark reminder of the biases Marcus was up against. But the older woman Marcus had helped earlier frowned deeply, her hands tightening around her scarf, as she whispered to herself, "This doesn't seem fair at all," her voice trembling with a mix of sympathy and frustration, her heart heavy with the injustice unfolding before her. Two security officers boarded the plane, their heavy boots thudding against the floor with a rhythmic intensity, their presence adding a new layer of tension that seemed to press down on the cabin like a storm cloud rolling in before a downpour. Their uniforms were crisp, their badges glinting under the harsh overhead lights, reflecting the artificial glow in a way that made them seem almost larger than life. They approached Marcus, their expressions professional but firm, their eyes scanning the cabin briefly before settling on him. "Sir, we've been asked to escort you to another seat," one officer said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of authority, his hand resting lightly on his belt, as if to signal his readiness to act. Marcus met their gaze, his posture unshaken despite the humiliation that burned in his chest like a wildfire, a searing pain that threatened to consume him if he let it. "This is my assigned seat," he said, his voice calm but resolute, a quiet strength in every word that seemed to echo his father's teachings of dignity in the face of adversity. He held up his boarding pass, the paper trembling slightly in his hand, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the injustice he was enduring, the edges creased from how tightly he'd gripped it earlier. "I have every right to be here," he added, his tone unwavering, his eyes locking onto the officers with a determination that made them pause, if only for a moment. Emily stepped forward, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression unyielding, her blue eyes flashing with a mix of irritation and defiance. "His seat is in economy," she insisted, her voice sharp enough to make the officers glance at her, their brows furrowing slightly as they processed her words. "He doesn't belong here," she added, her tone laced with a venom that made the older woman nearby gasp softly, her hand flying to her mouth in disbelief. The officers exchanged a quick look, a silent conversation passing between them, their training urging them to follow the lead flight attendant's instructions, even if something about the situation felt off. "Sir, please come with us," the second officer said, his tone softer but firm, his hand gesturing toward the aisle with a practiced motion, his eyes flickering with a hint of unease as he glanced at Marcus's boarding pass. Marcus took a deep breath, his jaw tightening as he fought to keep his composure, the weight of every passenger's stare pressing down on him like a physical force, each gaze a reminder of the public humiliation he was enduring. He gathered his belongings, his movements slow and deliberate, as if each action was a quiet act of defiance, a refusal to let Emily's prejudice break him. As he stood, the young girl in a pink sweater who'd asked her mother why Marcus had to leave, looked up at him, her eyes wide with confusion, her small hands clutching a stuffed bunny. Marcus paused, his heart softening despite the storm inside him, and he knelt down briefly, his voice gentle as he spoke to her. "Don't worry, little one," he said softly, his tone warm, a small smile tugging at his lips despite the pain in his chest. "Everything's gonna be okay." The girl's mother looked at him, her expression softening, a flicker of guilt in her eyes, as she realized the kindness Marcus was showing, even in the face of injustice. The older woman he'd helped earlier reached out as he passed, her frail hand brushing his sleeve, her touch light but filled with warmth. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her eyes brimming with sympathy, her voice a small beacon of kindness in the sea of judgment that surrounded him. Marcus gave her a small nod, his expression steady, but inside the humiliation burned deeper, a searing pain that clawed at his chest, threatening to unravel the composure he'd fought so hard to maintain. As he walked down the aisle to economy, the stares of passengers followed him, a mix of sympathy and judgment, their whispers a constant hum in his ears. The woman in the tailored blazer who'd supported Emily smirked again, her voice low but audible as she leaned toward the businessman. "See, that's why we need people like her to keep things in order," she said, her words a dagger that cut through the air, a reminder of the systemic biases Marcus was fighting against. Marcus settled into his new seat in economy, the cramped space a stark contrast to the luxury of first class, the seatbelt digging into his side as he adjusted himself, the fabric of the seat rough against his skin. The hum of the plane's engines filled the silence, a steady drone that seemed to mock the chaos in his mind, but it couldn't drown out the sting of Emily's words. "First class is for people who belong here," which echoed in his thoughts like a cruel taunt, each repetition a fresh wound. He closed his eyes for a moment, his hands resting on his knees, his fingers clenching slightly as he fought to steady his breathing, the memory of his father's lessons a quiet mantra. Dignity isn't given, it's earned through how you carry yourself. Back in first class, Emily strutted through the cabin, a smug smile playing on her lips as she adjusted her scarf with a flourish, her confidence restored now that Marcus was out of sight. "That's how you handle troublemakers," she said to a colleague, her voice loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Her tone dripping with self-satisfaction, a false bravado that masked the unease she refused to acknowledge. "First class isn't for everyone," she added, her words a dagger that reached Marcus's ears through the murmurs of passengers, each syllable a fresh wound, a reminder of the biases he'd fought his entire life. The businessman nodded in agreement, his lips curling into a smirk, but the older woman shook her head, her expression darkening with disapproval, her hands trembling as she clutched her scarf tighter, her heart heavy with the injustice she'd witnessed. But amidst the pain, a small act of kindness shifted the tide. An older passenger seated beside Marcus in economy leaned over, his voice low but firm, cutting through the fog of humiliation that clouded Marcus's mind. "I saw what happened," he whispered, his gray eyes sharp with conviction, his weathered face etched with lines that spoke of years in the skies. The man introduced himself as Mr. Carter, a retired pilot with a stern but kind demeanor, his hands resting on the armrest as he spoke, his fingers tapping lightly, as if recalling a memory. "I've flown with Ohio Airlines for years," he said, his voice thoughtful, a hint of pride in his tone as he spoke of the company's history, though he didn't know Marcus's true identity. "I've seen you before, at a company event a few years back. I don't know who you are, but you don't deserve this." Marcus nodded, a flicker of gratitude warming the cold ache in his chest. The older man's words a small lifeline in the storm of humiliation, a reminder that not everyone saw him through the lens of prejudice. Mr. Carter's resolve didn't stop there. Back in first class, Emily continued her smug remarks, oblivious to the shift happening behind the scenes, her voice carrying a false confidence as she chatted with her colleague, her laughter sharp and hollow. Mr. Carter quietly flagged down Grace, who had been watching the entire ordeal with growing unease, her hands still fidgeting with her apron, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and frustration. "Tell the captain what happened," Mr. Carter urged, his tone firm but gentle, his gray eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her pause. Grace hesitated, her heart racing, her mind flashing to her brother's struggles, the countless times he'd been judged for his skin color, the memory fueling her resolve. She thought of Marcus's quiet dignity, the way he'd held his head high despite the humiliation, and something inside her shifted. She nodded, her resolve hardening, her hand steadying as she took a deep breath. She slipped into the cockpit, her voice a soft whisper as she relayed the incident to the captain, her words trembling but determined. The captain's brow furrowed, his fingers tightening around the controls, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He knew Marcus's name from the airline's board, a name that changed everything. The call was made, setting the stage for a dramatic shift that would turn the tables on Emily's cruelty. A shift that Marcus had been quietly waiting for, his dignity unbroken despite the storm. Midway through the flight, as the plane soared over the Midwest, the cockpit's secure line rang, a sharp sound that cut through the steady hum of the engines, a sound that seemed to signal the turning of a tide. The captain picked up, his expression shifting from routine focus to one of surprise, then determination, as a familiar voice spoke on the other end. "Marcus Jackson, the owner of Ohio Airlines. I'm on this flight," Marcus said, his tone calm but firm, a quiet authority in his words that left no room for doubt, each syllable carrying the weight of years of hard work and resilience. "I was just moved to economy against my will. I expect this to be addressed immediately," he continued, his voice steady, a quiet fire burning beneath the surface, a fire fueled by the injustice he'd endured and the principles he'd built his company on. The captain's posture straightened, the weight of the call sinking in like a stone, his mind racing as he realized the gravity of the situation, the implications of what had just happened on his flight. He activated the intercom, his voice steady but urgent, a tone that commanded attention. "Miss Harper, report to the cockpit immediately," he announced, the words crackling through the cabin, a ripple of curiosity spreading among the passengers, their whispers growing louder as they sensed a shift in the air. Emily's confident stride faltered as she made her way to the cockpit, her earlier smugness replaced by a flicker of unease, the captain's serious tone catching her off guard like a sudden gust of wind. She adjusted her scarf nervously, her fingers fumbling with the fabric as she tried to steady herself, the small space of the cockpit feeling suddenly suffocating under the captain's stern gaze. She stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. "Miss Harper," the captain began, his voice low but firm, each word carrying the weight of authority, a weight that seemed to press down on Emily until she felt small, insignificant. "I've just spoken with Mr. Jackson, the owner of this airline. He's the passenger you forced out of first class," he said, his tone unyielding, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her stomach drop. Emily's face paled, her breath catching in her throat as the pieces fell into place, her smug narrative crumbling like a house of cards, the foundation of her confidence shattered in an instant. The man she'd humiliated, the man she'd dismissed as unworthy of first class, was her boss. The very person who held her career in his hands, the person she'd failed in the most fundamental way. Her knees weakened, a wave of panic washing over her like a tidal wave, her hands trembling as she clutched her scarf, the fabric twisting in her fingers as if it could anchor her in the storm of emotions crashing down on her. She thought of her years with Ohio Airlines, the countless flights, the passengers she'd served, the pride she'd once felt in her role, now tainted by her own prejudice, a stain she couldn't erase. "I didn't know he was—" she stammered, her voice trembling, her words faltering under the captain's piercing gaze, her mind scrambling for an excuse, for anything that could justify her actions. "That's irrelevant," the captain cut her off, his voice sharp, a blade that sliced through her excuses with ruthless precision. "What matters is how you treated him," he said, his words hitting her like a slap, a stark reminder of the principles she'd failed to uphold, the values Ohio Airlines was built on, values she'd trampled with her actions. Trembling, Emily turned and made her way to economy, her heart pounding in her chest, each step heavier than the last, her heels clicking softly against the floor, a sound that seemed to echo her own unraveling. She stopped at Marcus's row, her eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet his gaze, her hands still clutching her scarf as if it could shield her from the shame burning in her chest. "Mr. Jackson," he said, her voice uncharacteristically soft, barely above a whisper, the words trembling as they left her lips. "I'm so sorry. Please return to your seat." Marcus looked up, his expression calm but unyielding, a quiet strength in his eyes that made Emily shrink further, her earlier bravado gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability she couldn't hide. "This isn't about the seat," Marcus said, his voice steady, each word a quiet rebuke, a lesson in dignity that cut deeper than any shout. "It's about respect," he added, his eyes locking onto hers, a quiet fire in his gaze that made her flinch, the weight of her actions crashing down on her like a tidal wave. Marcus stood, his movements deliberate, each step a reclaiming of the dignity Emily had tried to strip from him, a quiet power in the way he carried himself. He walked back to first class, the weight of the moment settling over the cabin like a tidal wave, a shift so profound it seemed to ripple through the air. Passengers whispered in shock, their murmurs turning to gasps, then applause, as the truth of Marcus's identity spread through the rows like wildfire. The older woman he'd helped earlier clapped softly, her eyes shining with pride, her earlier sympathy now replaced by admiration, her hands trembling with emotion as she watched him reclaim his seat. The young girl in the pink sweater, who'd asked her mother why Marcus had to leave, tugged at her mother's sleeve again, her voice bright with excitement. "He's back, Mommy!" she exclaimed, her innocence a stark contrast to the weight of the moment, a reminder of the hope Marcus was fighting for, the same hope he'd reassured her about moments earlier. Her mother smiled softly, her earlier guilt replaced by a quiet respect, her hand resting on her daughter's shoulder as she joined in the applause. Emily's face burned with shame, her cheeks flushed a deep red, her hands trembling as she clutched her scarf, the weight of her actions crashing down on her with a force she couldn't withstand. She thought of the passengers who'd heard her smug remarks, the colleagues who'd witnessed her cruelty, the career she'd jeopardized with her prejudice. Each thought a dagger, each memory a reminder of her failure. Marcus settled back into his seat, his presence commanding respect, a quiet power in the way he adjusted his hoodie, the same hoodie Emily had judged him for, now a symbol of his resilience. But his gaze remained fixed on Emily, his eyes sharp with a promise of accountability, a promise that made her stomach twist with dread. "We'll discuss this when we land," he said, his tone a quiet warning, a reminder that her actions would have consequences, a reminder that respect wasn't a privilege to be gatekept, but a right to be upheld. Emily stood frozen, the applause of the passengers a stark contrast to the storm of regret raging inside her, a storm that threatened to drown her if she let it. She thought of her first day at Ohio Airlines, the excitement she'd felt, the dreams she'd had, dreams now tainted by her own actions, dreams she'd have to fight to reclaim. For Marcus, the moment was bittersweet, a reclaiming of his dignity, yes, but also a painful reminder of the work still needed to ensure fairness for all. A reminder that even at the top, the fight for respect was far from over. The balance of power had shifted, and as the plane continued its journey to Cleveland, Emily knew her career and her perspective would never be the same, while Marcus sat quietly, his father's lessons ringing true, his resolve stronger than ever. The plane touched down in Cleveland with a gentle thud, the wheels meeting the tarmac as a wave of anticipation rippled through the cabin. Through the small oval windows, passengers caught sight of a sleek black SUV pulling up beside the aircraft, its polished exterior gleaming under the airport lights, a stark contrast to the gray concrete runway. Marcus Jackson stepped out, his casual hoodie now replaced by a sharp, tailored suit, the fabric hugging his frame with a quiet authority that commanded attention. Flanked by two executives in crisp blazers, their expressions serious, he ascended the stairs with a purposeful stride, each step a declaration of the justice he was about to deliver. As he entered the cabin, conversations hushed instantly, the air thick with anticipation, every eye turning to him as if drawn by a magnetic force. Marcus walked straight to Emily, who stood frozen at the front of the cabin, her face pale as a ghost, her hands trembling as she clutched her uniform scarf, the fabric twisted into knots by her nervous fingers. "Miss Harper," Marcus began, his voice steady but carrying a weight that seemed to fill the entire cabin, each word a testament to the principles he'd built his life on. "I built this airline on principles of respect and dignity. Values my father taught me, values that every employee here is expected to uphold. Your actions today failed those values in the most fundamental way." The words hit Emily like a punch, her breath catching in her throat, her earlier bravado completely gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability that made her look smaller, more fragile than ever before. She opened her mouth to speak, her lips parting in a desperate attempt to explain herself. But no words came, her voice silenced by the weight of her own shame, a shame that burned in her chest like a fire she couldn't extinguish. Marcus turned to face the cabin, his gaze sweeping over the passengers, his presence commanding a respect that filled the space with a palpable energy. "This airline succeeds because we treat every passenger with fairness, regardless of who they are," he said, his voice firm but tinged with a quiet passion, a passion born from years of fighting the same biases he'd faced today. What happened today was unacceptable, a failure not just to me, but to every person who trusts Ohio Airlines to be better. Passengers erupted in applause, their approval echoing through the cabin like a wave, the sound a powerful affirmation of Marcus's words. The older woman who'd sympathized with Marcus earlier dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her hands trembling with emotion, her heart swelling with pride for the man she'd seen endure such injustice with unwavering dignity. The young girl in the pink sweater who'd asked her mother why Marcus had to leave, clapped her small hands together, her face lighting up with a bright smile, her innocence a stark contrast to the weight of the moment, a reminder of the hope Marcus was fighting for. Emily's head hung low, her hands trembling as she clutched her scarf even tighter, the fabric now a lifeline in the storm of her regret. She thought of her years with Ohio Airlines, the pride she'd once felt in her uniform, now tainted by her own actions, a stain she feared she'd never wash away. Marcus turned to the executives at his side, his expression resolute, a quiet fire in his eyes that spoke of a man who'd turned humiliation into a stand for justice. "Miss Harper is removed from duty, effective immediately," he said, his voice unwavering, each word a final judgment on her actions. One of the executives stepped forward, a tall man with a stern demeanor, his clipboard tucked under his arm as he gestured to Emily. "Please come with us," he said, his tone professional but cold, a stark contrast to the warmth Marcus had shown even in his reprimand. Emily nodded silently, her shoulders slumping as she followed the executive off the plane, her heels clicking softly against the floor, each step a reminder of the career she'd jeopardized, the lessons she'd learned too late. As Emily disappeared down the jetway, Grace approached Marcus, her kind brown eyes shining with gratitude, her hands no longer fidgeting but steady with a newfound confidence. "Thank you, Mr. Jackson," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion, a quiet strength in her words that spoke of the courage she'd found in standing up for what was right. Marcus smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression as he shook her hand, his grip firm but comforting. "You showed courage today, Grace," he said, his voice soft but filled with admiration. "You'll hear from my office about a promotion. I need people like you leading this team." Grace's eyes widened, a flicker of hope blooming into a quiet pride, her heart swelling with the realization that her small act of defiance had not gone unnoticed, that she'd made a difference in a moment that mattered. Marcus's resolve had turned a moment of humiliation into a powerful stand for justice, a stand that resonated with every passenger in the cabin. As the plane emptied, passengers cast him looks of admiration, their whispers now filled with respect rather than judgment, their eyes reflecting a newfound appreciation for the man who'd fought for fairness. The businessman who'd once muttered against Marcus now avoided his gaze, his earlier arrogance replaced by a quiet shame, a lesson learned in the face of Marcus's dignity. Marcus stood at the front of the cabin, his father's lessons ringing true in his mind. Always carry yourself with dignity, even when others don't. A mantra that had guided him through the storm and into this moment of triumph. He'd not only reclaimed his seat but also the respect he deserved, teaching a powerful lesson in equality that would echo far beyond the walls of the cabin, a lesson that left him feeling both vindicated and hopeful for the change he could inspire. In the weeks that followed, Ohio Airlines underwent a transformation that rippled through every level of the company, a change born from Marcus's unwavering commitment to justice. He ordered a comprehensive review of staff training, his voice firm as he addressed his executive team in a sleek boardroom, the city skyline visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "We can't let this happen again," he said, his tone unyielding, his hands resting on the polished table as he outlined his vision. Mandatory workshops on diversity and respect were implemented, each session a deep dive into confronting biases through role-playing and real-world stories. The kind of stories Marcus had lived through. Stories that ensured no passenger would ever face what he had. Employees sat in circles, their notebooks open, their faces a mix of reflection and determination as they listened to a facilitator share a story of a young woman denied service because of her race, the parallels to Marcus's experience striking a chord. A reminder of the work still needed to make fairness a reality for all. Emily, after her dismissal, spent her evenings alone in her small apartment, the silence of the space a stark contrast to the bustling cabins she'd once commanded. She sat at her kitchen table, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands, her mind replaying the incident over and over, each memory a lesson in humility she couldn't ignore. One evening she opened her laptop, her fingers trembling as she typed a heartfelt email to Marcus, the words pouring out like a confession. "I'm sorry for my actions, for the pain I caused you. I've spent these weeks reflecting and I vow to change, to be better." She hit send, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope, unsure if Marcus would even respond. Days later, a reply came, Marcus's words measured but kind. "I see your sincerity, Emily. You can return under probation. Prove your growth through your actions." Emily's eyes filled with tears, a flicker of gratitude blooming into a quiet determination. Her transformation becoming a testament to growth, a second chance she was determined not to waste. As she prepared to return to Ohio Airlines, her perspective forever changed. The incident sparked a broader movement, one that reached far beyond the walls of Ohio Airlines. A movement Marcus hadn't anticipated, but embraced with open arms. He stood at a press conference weeks later, a sea of microphones and cameras before him, his suit sharp, his voice steady as he spoke words that would soon go viral. "Respect is a responsibility, not a privilege. A responsibility we all share, no matter who we are." The crowd erupted in applause, the sound echoing through the conference room, a powerful affirmation of his message. Hashtags like "Respect for All" began trending on social media, posts flooding in from people sharing their own stories of injustice, their voices a chorus of solidarity that inspired conversations about equality across the country. A young woman in Chicago tweeted, "I faced the same judgment on a flight last year. Marcus's story gives me hope." Her words retweeted thousands of times, a ripple effect that turned Marcus's stand into a catalyst for change, a beacon for those who'd felt unseen. Grace thrived in her new role as a lead flight attendant, her promotion a testament to the courage she'd shown that day, her quiet strength a beacon for the crew. She stood at the front of a training session, her voice steady as she shared Marcus's story with a group of new hires, her kind brown eyes shining with pride. "We have the power to make every passenger feel valued," she said, her words a reminder of the lesson she'd learned, a lesson she now passed on to others, ensuring the culture of Ohio Airlines would reflect the fairness Marcus had fought for. Her colleagues nodded, their faces reflecting a mix of inspiration and determination, their hands jotting down notes as they prepared to carry Grace's message into every flight, every interaction, a legacy of change that started with one brave whisper, "This isn't right." Marcus flew again, months later. Seated in first class, the cabin now a far cry from the tension of that fateful day. The crew greeted him with genuine smiles, their warmth a reflection of the changes he'd inspired. Their uniforms crisp, but their demeanor softer, more welcoming. He glanced around, his eyes lingering on a young black family seated nearby, their laughter filling the air as they settled into their seats, their presence a quiet victory, in a space that had once tried to exclude him. A quiet satisfaction washed over him, a feeling that bloomed into a deep pride in the airline he'd built, in the change he'd fought for, in the lessons his father had taught him, lessons that had carried him through the storm and into this moment of triumph. Change wasn't easy, but as Marcus looked out the window at the Cleveland skyline fading into the distance, he knew it was worth fighting for. A fight he'd continue for as long as it took to make fairness a reality for all. Have you ever faced unfair treatment? Share your story in the comments, like this video, and subscribe for more inspiring tales of justice and resilience.